right? So if you don't fix infrastructure, then people's lives are incredibly negatively affected no matter what. And then it's just even worse when that disaster hits.
Welcome back to the Commons for Justice podcast, the show that aims to engage the community in crucial, complex, and sometimes controversial discussions about the past, present, and future of race, risk, and resilience in coastal communities. I'm your host, Genai Witter, and today we're focusing on the fascinating role that art and humanities play in race, risk, and resilience with Dr. Rebecca Friedman. Dr. Friedman is a co-organizer on the Commons for Justice grant, an associate professor at FIU, and the founding director of FIU's Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. The Commons for Justice grant sets out to meet a multidisciplinary challenge present in traditional disaster analysis by blending humanities, social, and natural sciences in its approach to gain a more comprehensive perspective on disaster risk and resilience. The human-centered approach is evident in the grant's partnership with the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, led by none other than Dr. Rebecca Friedman. Dr. Friedman, I want to start by defining humanities. What does it mean, and what does it encompass?
Sure, that's just a small question. Easily answered. I mean, before I define humanities, if I could just back up for a
Oh, yeah.
second and say how exciting it is to me to be part of this project, because precisely of what you said is the way in which Dr. Olson and the grant and the Mellon Foundation encouraged projects that bring together disciplines in meaningful ways. But I think that this project really insists that we interact with each other, we engage with each other in the academy, and then we leverage all of that knowledge and all of those approaches as we kind of co-create various solutions and discussions and analyses with all the communities with whom we work. So the actual wedding of disciplines for sure is what makes this powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, just as a small example, if I
Oh,
may,
yeah. Go for it.
so often, as you know, these categories of disciplines are so walled off from one another.
Mhm.
So if you think about natural disasters, hurricanes is the obvious one in the Miami context, right? And I remember being at an event where there were community members talking about the impacts of hurricanes on, I think it was a Liberty City community, and there were residents saying like, I can't be worrying about preparing for a hurricane when my roof is still leaking from the last hurricane. So there's a way in which the kind of socioeconomics, which of course is partly the human condition, as it were, impacts all the science, all the social science in the world. And so to have the scientists listening to the residents, right, to have the social scientists paying attention and allowing for kind of more humanistic perspectives in our interactions with communities, I think is what gives this power. So in terms of humanities, like what's the added value? I mean, it's an amorphous question. It's one that historians, literary scholars, art historians, architects, on and on are constantly, religious studies people are constantly asking, what does that mean to like say that we study the human condition, right? I guess on some level, it's being attentive to narratives and the ways in which narratives are created through societies, through cultures, through impact individuals, communities, nations, the world. For me, culture is always central. And that means, like, for example, like identities are necessarily crafted through culture, right? And so that's a kind of, to me, a humanities perspective. And so if we bring those analyses and those narratives to bear on these kind of so-called real world problems, I think it's really powerful.
So now that we have understanding of humanities, I want to shift our focus to exploring how humanities and qualitative social sciences approach contribute to community-driven strategies for risk reduction and resilience. So why is this multidisciplinary, holistic approach so important? And what do we gain by going deeper into these narratives alongside quantitative data that we collect? How does it enhance our understanding of the challenges faced by underserved and marginalized communities while also shedding a light on the overlooked aspects of race, risk, and resilience?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's many ways to answer those questions and that question. In terms of qualitative approaches, the first thing is really like having understanding that we're not just dealing with data points, understanding that there are humans behind those data points, right? And that their neighborhoods and histories and pasts, and that people are living their daily lives. Heat rises, even as the seas rise, and all of it. And so, how do the socioeconomic realities and cultural traditions in each of these communities, in each of these families, interact with all of these natural disasters, which PS are not natural disasters because
Exactly.
they're human
Hmm.
created disasters. And so even understanding that, like it feels to me kind of empty to say to an impoverished community hit by a hurricane, like, don't forget to recycle your bottles, so it's like the messages have to be different depending on the kind of everyday realities of the communities with whom we're interacting. And so to have a storytelling initiative as we do in this grant, talking to the communities. The way, as you know, it's set up is that I, as a professor, am not going to walk into community and if I don't know anybody and say, hey, hi, I have my recorder, will you talk to me? But rather, we are going through the grassroots organizations who might be from the community, whose employees might be of the community, might not, but in any event, they have interacted and developed rapport. So all of that is a kind of qualitative, emotionally attuned way of approaching ultimately a scientific problem. We always say this from the public humanities perspective, but like developing trust is like the number one thing you have to do, because if you're talking about qualitative research that has to do with humans, you can't wield your power, right? As a kind of university professors, you
Exactly.
can't like extract information that doesn't come back to actually help the communities. All of those things are almost traps. And we have to be super hyper intentional in our as we build relationships, as we should be anyway, frankly, But I would say humanities demands it and public humanities insists on it.
And that's something that I talk about a lot. Like when we're talking about understanding the impact of disaster on people's lives, it's not just about crunching numbers. And I feel like a lot of people in this field kind of want to separate the human from the scientific point of view, and
Yes.
it doesn't make any sense. And
No.
by doing that, they're also ignoring the intersectionality of everything that's at play here.
Exactly.
And I feel like, yeah, like quantitative data gives us one piece of the puzzle, but it's the qualitative methods that are really allowing us to get up close and personal with
Yes.
these communities and the real experiences that they're facing. I had a few conversations with people, and it's things that you wouldn't even think twice about, and I spoke to this woman, and she was talking about how the drainage systems cause so much flooding and how sometimes she can't even take her daughter to school because the streets are flooded. It's things like this that people need to understand if you're going to go into these communities and tell them, oh, like we need to do X, Y, and Z. And I feel
Right.
like certain organizations fall into the white savior complex.
Yes.
And come in and they're like, we're going to tell you what to do. And they're not listening. And I feel like that goes to your point of what you were saying about developing trust.
Exactly. I mean, and also, if I may, like with your example, why is it flooding? Because the whether it's the city, the county, the state, whatever, has not invested in that community in fixing infrastructure. Right. So if you don't fix infrastructure, then people's lives are incredibly negatively affected no matter what. And then it's just even worse when that disaster hits.
And when it comes to disaster risk and resilience, I feel like communities of color are often disproportionately impacted and face all of these intersectional challenges like we spoke about. And when we dig into the social and cultural and historical aspects of these communities, we can better comprehend how things like racial inequalities intersect with disaster vulnerability. As we mentioned before, one of the major aspects of the Grants Humanities approach is its partnership with the WPHL. Dr. Friedman, we'd love to explore the lab's role in shining a light on these systemic issues that amplify risk and hinder equitable access to resilience resources. So, what innovative methods does it employ to foster community capacity within these affected areas while also exploring the intricate nuances of race and risk in disaster and environmental crises?
I mean, so this particular project came at a really good time because The lab has been around for, I think, 4 years now, not even 3 to 4 years. So one of the groups that we started to form was environmental humanities. There was like a group of faculty who were very interested in the environment and thinking about from historical, literary perspectives, how we understand the environment, and then religious perspectives, how different societies have coped and so forth with environmental risk. And then at that very moment, Dr. Olson had approached us to kind of partner on this.
Oh,
so I was
okay.
already kind of beginning to understand that this was an area of research for humanists, right? The environment. How does one wed academic approaches with kind of community oriented approaches? How do you move from the ivory tower, right? I don't want to say into the streets because that doesn't quite sound right, but in
But
a way it
yeah,
is
yeah.
outside of the ivory tower into the communities. I think that that is a culture shift. And I would say that culture shift is as significant for faculty as it is for members of the community who are developing relationships of trust with faculty. In other words, many of us have grown up in ivory towers, and it's scary out there.
Literally, that's something that Dr. Grove and I spoke about the other day, about how
Okay.
you can live in one part of Miami and not know what's going on in the other part. This
100%.
is a completely different reality to most people.
100%. And that has to do with hierarchies and power dynamics and the way that education is distributed, across this country. And we could go on and on about institutional racism, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that, and so forth and so on. But in any event, in this particular instance, it was really interesting to think about how to bridge that gap. And I think the only way I can think about it now in retrospect is this idea of narrative and storytelling. Okay. Because narrative and storytelling is something that academics can understand. If you're a literary scholar, if you're a historian, if you're a religious studies scholar, you understand narratives, you understand ideas, understand the power dynamics of telling that story, right? Who is the audience? Who is the speaker? Why is it like that? Can we switch the hierarchy, right? Can we switch all of that? So a lot of the work that the WPHL has done on this grant, beyond kind of relatively traditional oral history gathering, which is what historians do and humanists do, but also getting members of the community together. And we're going to talk about art in a minute, but a lot of it has been kind of art focused, and how the visual relates to the textual in these contexts. How do communities, so let's talk about resilience in particular. What is resilience? What is resiliency? It's actually become a hot button word. A lot of people are rejecting that word, actually, because resilience in many instances implies that communities, first of all, are defined by their challenges, and they maybe don't want to be, and especially if those are not challenges of their own making. So there's actually again, talking about the relationship between the academy and, kind of organic knowledge that develops in the community, a whole body of literature now about resilience and resiliency as a kind of question mark. What does that mean? What's embedded in that term? What assumption? Yeah. What are the assumptions built into that? Anyway, so I think the work that we do in thinking through and asking community members, whether they're artists or, storytellers of various kinds, how can stories, how can history, how can the past be a way to feel grounded in the present with such a kind of uncertain future looming? So it allows for a kind of grounding of communities, a sense of identity, for lack of a better word, and to leverage that, and not really feeling, but in being, to use our word, resilient. So it's like history and the past, and teaching that past to one's own community, allow for a sense of resiliency and identity and power, right, in the face of outside forces. So I think that's one way in which storytelling and that piece of the grant, and the piece of the grant that's about curriculum building and history exchanges, and which is all falls within the realm of the humanities part of it, is very, very powerful. Is working with communities, listening to communities, right, and leveraging our resources in service of their needs.
And that's also a big reason why I created this podcast. Was I felt like, in terms of the community, a lot of scientific jargon that we throw around here. It's not digestible to the general public, and I feel like this is so important. The work that's happening here, the things that are happening, is so important, and people need to know this. And I wanted to break it down and tell it through a storytelling kind of forum, so that we could understand how we got here, what we're doing to fix it, and kind of what the future is going to look like. Because I feel like that, like you said, the narrative and the storytelling, it's so important. And I feel like meet the empathy and the humanity and everyone else. And I kind of wanted to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier about the creation of the lab kind of served as a bridge, you know? And I wanted to talk about art as a bridge. So, as the founding director of the lab, you've been at the forefront of incorporating arts and humanities into the conversation of disaster risk and resilience. In your opinion, how can art act as a vehicle to bridge the gap between scientific research and policymaking and the lived experiences and capacities of marginalized communities?
I think the best way to answer your question is by way of example. So there's kind of always a dialogue between the individual, right, and the art itself. And that dialogue, I think, can get at the very kind of human aspect of if it's an exhibition that weighs on issues of race, risk, resilience, and natural disasters, then that's the conversation that they'll have with themselves. And then if we create a public event, we'll have it with others, right, with communities. And you know what? I'll talk about the final two exhibitions that will happen next summer. And I think they're both really good examples of the ways in which art engages communities and also speaks to the themes of this grant. So the first one I'll talk about is called Under a Simple Tree. And so that exhibition is curated by Chris Norwood. He does multimedia pieces. For this show, Marvin Weeks is going to pick, I think he said 10 trees in different neighborhoods around greater Miami and use pieces of those trees to build and create art pieces. But they're going around to different neighborhoods, talking to people, learning about the role of those particular trees. So tree canopy, shade, who actually spends their everyday lives under that tree, why them, why there, is it getting cut down, how does natural disaster and rising heat weigh on that. So that exhibition will feature those 10 multimedia pieces, but also where the lab is going to work with Chris to go to the sites and to talk to people and to record those stories of what they have to say about that particular tree, because it's going to be at Green Space Miami next summer. So from May through August 2024, we're going to have like a little symposium about like the socioeconomics of shade in Miami. We're going to bring in scientific, I don't know, it's like whatever that means. We're going to bring in experts from a multiplicity of disciplines to talk about shade and canopy. And there have been all these research that's been done. So it will bring in the qualitative, the quantitative, the humanistic through the storytelling, and also the art. Because right, so that's all right. That's one. The other one, we're working with the Haitian Cultural Arts Alliance and with Carl Just, who is the curator of these two shows. One is called Call to the Ancestors, and it's about the Lincoln Memorial Park. But the other one is called I Am Little Haiti, and that show is going to be at Green Space while Chris has his show. So Carl and Chris are going to be in the same space next summer, next to each other, because there's two art spaces. And that show really looks at the changing nature of the neighborhood of Little Haiti through four media. So through photography, through visual arts, through videography, and through writing. And so the exhibition is going to be the sum total of these four chapters is how we've conceptualized it. And we've already done the photography. So we did a photo walk a while ago by now where we asked members of the community to come to Carl's art space, IPC art space in Little Haiti, to spend 2 to 3 hours in the neighborhood and take pictures. And we've asked a writer to write about those photos, and it's super powerful. And so same things are going to happen in all the other media. The first thing we're going to do is have a kind of history harvest where we ask members of the Little Haiti community or Haitians, it doesn't, or maybe everyone, I don't know yet, to bring in objects that evoke for them personally their migration experience, so their experience of coming to Miami. I mean, with a focus on from Haiti. And we'll find somebody to write about those and to photograph those and to get their individual stories. And that becomes part of the exhibition. So on and on. So you can see that it's a very kind of community co-curated, organic exhibition that has the kind of intentional theme of how this neighborhood is changing, largely due to climate gentrification, increased flooding, and the like. So you can see how art will engage communities in a whole other level. And so we're good. It's also about like bringing communities, like celebrating the roots, celebrating their history, celebrating their culture. And I would argue that's part of the whole like resilience aspect.
I wanted to focus on art as community resilience, but also as a tool for resistance. As we've discussed, there's ways in which art can act as a vehicle for transdisciplinary collaboration, and I feel like that's something that you were speaking about. But specifically, how art can be used as a tool for community resilience, healing, and empowerment. Can you expand on how this project will effectively communicate the challenges and the experiences of Little Haiti residents amidst transitions? How will that give residents a feeling of healing or empowerment?
Great question. I think it has the potential to see themselves in the exhibition, and that in and of itself could be a transformative experience, right? That empathy, that the like beauty in it is the beauty in themselves, to be part of this community that has produced all of this beautiful art and has connections to a place that they left, many of them left. So it's also like the kind of common experience. I mean, one could argue, and actually Carl always talks about, why would we talk about the Haitian migration experience isolated from another group's experience? So he's always thinking about the whole. But this show has the potential to allow the, like I said, the audience and the artists to reflect collectively and individually and within families upon their own experiences, to pause on it, to embrace it, to feel proud in the resistance, in the power, in the strength that brought them here to create their lives and this beautiful community that continues despite the fact that the number of streets called Little Haiti is shrinking every day, that strangers are in their midst. Despite all of that, it's like a reminder for everybody that they are part of this community and they have something to be proud of, even as things shift and change. And so I think an art exhibit like this, which asks community members to participate, which celebrates their power, beauty, resilience, is in a way defiant, is in a way a protest against the mainstream and against what's happening all around.
That's what I want to get into now, is about the way that art can be used as a tool for resistance against environmental and social injustices. I think that it's really important to explore how artists have utilized their creativity to challenge systemic inequalities, to inspire activism and mobilize communities around resilient efforts, and also spark important conversations about race, risk, and resilience. And I feel like the impact of art in fostering community resilience is truly remarkable, but I also think that the impact of art in fostering resistance is also really, really important.
The Lincoln Memorial Project, Call to the Ancestors, is not only a kind of historical look at the largest Black cemetery that has a very violent history in Miami, but it also honors those who rest there in all their multicultural, because it's like you have a lot of Bahamians, you have African Americans, you have Haitians, you have Jamaicans. It represents many different communities in Miami who rest there, and veterans. So we are going to have the second half of the exhibit. We've asked artists to create pieces that honor and reflect on rituals of transition from life to death in their community. So we have like a indigenous version, we have a Central South American, we have Haitian, we have African American. So we've asked a variety of artists to create pieces that will then become part of the exhibition. And so that also kind of like embraces commonality, but also celebrates difference, if you will, and is also in a way a kind of resistance against the violent history that cemetery represents, where Black bodies were interred from white cemeteries and just thrown in there.
I remember seeing the pictures of it before, and there was vines and like weeds covering so many different burial plots. People didn't even know where their people was buried, and I think that story about Jesse Wooden, who looking for his mom, I mean, that just it's so heavy, and it also talks to the city trying to come and pay him for the cemetery and how he resisted. And through the exhibition that I went to, shows again how art can act as resistance to gentrification.
Well, come see the show. It opens on, I can do a plug. I think it opens on September 14th,
Okay.
Little Hazy Cultural Council.
I think that, like I said, art has proven to be a powerful tool in resistance and resilience. Can you share any examples of how art, specifically exhibitions that you've curated in the past, whether it be for this grant or outside of the grant, how it can ignite a sense of collective action, raise awareness?
There's so many examples. I'm just going to give you the one that's front of mind, which is documentary photography exhibit. It's also with Carl, just at IPC Art Space that will open in for Art Basel 2023. And that show is called Defiance. And that is a collective show of documentary photographers, journalists, I think mostly, who made images in summer of 2020. So it's really about the summer of protest all across the country, right? There's a focus on Miami, but not only. It marks that summer. And they're beautiful photographs of joy, of pain, of police brutality, and what that summer meant, which was, defiance. People are in the streets and they are protesting. And so collective action. And so the idea is to meditate on that moment and to look at those beautiful photographs.
That's so exciting. We talked about the present, so I kind of want to talk about the future a little bit. So, how do you think art has shaped culture and the future of race, risk, and resilience in Miami, but even outside of Miami? What's in motion right now that you think is setting us up for a space in which art can have a kind of permanent residence in this conversation?
That's a great question too. I mean, I think if we can collectively commit, intentionally and collectively commit to supporting artists and their visions of depicting the natural environments around them, depicting their experiences in these neighborhoods as they significantly change, honoring them and their visions, right? And a lot of that simply has to do with institutional support. There are lots of artists out there who have a lot to say, right? And they're saying it, but I think to have the support of institutions is hugely important to make that happen. And so I think one of the problems, if I may, about art is that so often art is displayed in museums. And we know well that museums tend to be elite spaces where, white wealthy people feel very comfortable. That's exclusionary. So if we can get art out of museums, I mean, at the same time that we have to kind of push back against that museum culture, but if we can simultaneously do both, whether it's galleries, sometimes galleries are the places, or sometimes it's in the streets. I just went to a talk about art collectives, but also like the public display of art, I think is where the future kind of resides. Projects that force publics to engage with one another and with the art itself, as our communities and neighborhoods significantly transform, it becomes a kind of daily practice to stop for a minute, to think about whatever that piece is, and to reflect upon what's going on. And maybe that inspires some to act differently in their lives.
So I have a question. I want to know what methods or what forms can art or humanities take to be like a baton to the next generation, to pass on knowledge and tell stories about either warning or setting us up for the future. What role can art play in educating the next generation?
It's a really, really important question. And it's honestly one that me and colleagues, primarily community colleagues, talk about all the time. There's a project that we have with what's now called Little Bahamas of Coconut Grove, but the West Grove. And it's to record the elders. And those conversations always begin with the question you asked. It's like, we can record these. We can have these in the FIU repository or even in the public library in the Grove. Like, if you look at a neighborhood like West Grove, it's like the Bahamians that are still there are few and far between, and they're all older, right? And even if you think about Bahamians in Miami writ large who don't live in West Grove but still identify with it, which is a large population of people, they tend to be older. And so how do you get the so-called whoever they are young folks engaged? Everyone's always talking about the young folks, whoever they are. You're the young folk, you're the young folk, right? Engaged in this. And what people always turn to, what everyone always turns to is technology. I think it's also, well, three things. It's supporting young artists, right? And having them mentored by people who know this history and care and they can together kind of create new versions of art as activists, art as the preservation of history and all of that, right? And I think it's also like old people like me and my colleagues learning and knowing how to talk to younger generations. I'm sure technology is the key. So it's either learning ourselves or getting people to help us make that happen. So a lot of the projects I'm involved in now have like the QR code or the podcast or the whatever is the next thing.
Because I feel
exactly.
Like there's so much resentment or like I don't know, like so much desire to not kind of engage with us online, or it's seen as a bad thing, but I'm like, this is the form that we absorb information through. This is where we are. Yes. And I feel like it's so important to just meet people where they are, You
can throw something that's more old-fashioned in the mix, but you have to meet people where you are.
What are your hopes for the future in terms of race, risk, resilience, humanities, art, the world? What are your desires? What are your hopes? What are your aspirations for the future?
I guess like I'm a very optimistic person just by nature. And so despite the state we live in, despite all the kind of negative pressures around social justice issues, and I am going to choose to believe that all of this is because we're getting closer and that this is like the final attempt to stop us from moving forward in ways that are equitable and justice filled. And so it's going to be okay. And then I think we have to just keep pushing and do the work that we do, because I certainly have no choice. And I don't think any of us who do this work have any choice but to use the resources that we have and the power and privilege that we have as people at the university, whether you're a student or a professor, and to use that privilege and power for good. And for me, it's through arts and humanities, because that's what I know and I love. But from whatever aspect you enter, whether it's law or whatever it is to just keep pushing and keep having your voice heard.
If we do come together and kind of like buckle down and go with this collective action, yes. I think the kids will be all right,
I completely agree.
We'll
and I think
fine.
It's through art, it's through storytelling, it's through remembering the past, it's through music, it's through dance, it's through all those mediums, it's through photography, it's through all of those things that we can come together and push forward and keep it a beautiful world.
As we wrap up this episode, take a moment to reflect on what role you can play in inspiring the next generation and standing against injustice through creative expression. And as always, what are your hopes for the future, and how can you challenge yourself to become an advocate for change? Until next time, continue exploring, questioning, and advocating for a world where justice is the common thread weaving us all together. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Commons for Justice podcast.